we're pleased to have with us some invited guests who are here in the whole despite. We appreciate that very much. Thank you. For roll call, why don't we just go around, and I'm not sure if everyone who's been invited is aware of each of us. So, John, why don't you just go around the table and introduce yourself, and we'll count that as roll call.
All right, my name is John Walker.
Norton Gilbert.
Joe Gastiger.
Scott Jones.
So I'm not trying to be silent here. Bill Nicholas is the manager. I'm not on the HRC.
Right. Larry Apperson, the chair of HRC. And we have a new city liaison to the HRC, Joshua Holt, and we'll welcome him and say thank you. We're not sure if we're the short straw, on the assignments, but we're glad to see you here.
And then we have a couple of people in the fan zone.
And then we've got our remote folks. I'm not sure if we can hear you, but if you introduce yourself. Lisa and Nadine.
Yeah, I'm here. Nadine's dog is so you can hear us indeed.
Oh, okay.
And you know what, I forgot that we were having guests today. But the weather is just a bit much for me today.
Okay.
In light of all that is going on in my world at this moment. So I do apologize, but welcome, I'm Lisa King. I think Nadine will be right back. She's going to take the dog to a more quiet environment.
All right. Well, the dog keeper is Nadine Franklin, and I know Bill. You want to introduce Casey?
Yeah, I'm Will Heinisch, so a local businessman, and then I've got townhomes that I rent out in DeKalb, and I was one of the founders of the DeKalb Area Rental Association that started probably 6 years ago or so. So, and right now I'm still active on the board with the Rental Association and membership chairman.
Yeah, my name is Mike Pitsley. I know some of the people in here. Pitsley Realty, we do a lot of apartment rentals. I've been on your committee at one time, many years ago. I'm a member of DAR as well.
Okay.
Christine Cruz, property manager at Gideon Court Apartments. It is a low-income subsidized property in DeKalb.
Okay. Well, welcome again. We appreciate you coming out on our weather. To help move along with the minutes over the agenda, we need to approve our agenda. I have one addition. I don't know if anybody else has any changes. Under old business, I had forgotten to put the City of DeKalb Zoom, information. You may recall at our last meeting, John had been good enough. He had a meeting the next day. I think it was with Bill Nicholas. And we want you to report on that. So if that is all right, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda with the F3 City of DeKalb Zoom license.
So moved.
Second from Joe. Thank you very much. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Okay, opposed, same sign. All right, great. Then our minutes, those should have been sent out as a part of the agenda.
They were.
And I don't know if there's any additions, corrections, or, All right, pending motion to approve the January 19th, 21 regular meeting minutes.
Also moved.
Okay, Joe, thank you. Second from John. All right, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
Okay, opposed, same sign.
Get Nadine, I don't know. if
Oh, I'm
Nadine's
sorry.
or not.
I don't know if they're hearing us.
Lisa is. Lisa, you hear us, right?
I do, yes, and I'm saying aye.
Okay, thank you.
Next
And Nadine?
Maybe you need to start us up. I
give me that, because I'll
I
turn
have
it
said
off.
aye both times, John, I'm here too.
Okay,
Okay.
all right, and other than our invited guests, I do not believe we have any public, and we obviously have our guests on the agenda, so unless there's something not related to, our agenda items, certainly feel free to state anything, questions or, okay, seeing none, will indicate there's none there. And old business then, we've been having our police community relations on the agenda for a number of meetings. And I'll ask Bill if you have any updates or,
I do.
okay, good.
Yes, I do. For the present and into the future, I think an important part of police community relations is the current search for a permanent police chief. Lisa and Will and Mike are members of the police chief search committee, community search committee, as is John. John and Lisa and Will and Mike chime in if there's anything you want to add to this, but I just want to briefly say that we're at a point where we had 27 candidates. We did a call down to less than 10, and at this point we're finishing some, I guess you'd call it screening, to try to get down to the interview, the final interview size, which is going to be somewhere around 3 to 4 to be determined. And can you hear me all right, Lisa? Am I speaking up enough? I don't know if you can. And we'll have the last two, we have 2 internals, and they will be interviewed, same questions and so forth. Each gets about a half an hour with 4 questions, so it's a mini interview, but we got 4 externals, actually at 5, we're down to 4 now. And
I'm sorry, Bill, I was muted, I can hear you.
can you hear me all right?
I can, yeah.
Good. So we'll have 2 more Thursday night, and then we'll complete that, and then we'll have, then the hard part, we have some conversation, and everything we've been doing has been consensual, and we've been everybody's been very forthcoming. It's been, I think, a very constructive and positive process to this point. You saw the profile that went out for candidates to respond to, and so there weren't a lot of surprises. I mean, people knew a lot about the department, at least on paper, coming in, so we could address some pretty tough questions. And the 4 questions that we've been asking, one has to do with the law, which we talked briefly about, the state legislature passed about a month ago, and its implications for training, both for persons who are going through academies and also for persons who have been certified as police officers, and what kind of ongoing training requirements there would be. One was addressing the Citizens Review Board. What kind of experience have you had? What do you think? And others. So that's where we are. By the time you next meet, we may be pretty darn close to candidates. In addition to the search committee, which is going to pull this down to the interview size, we're going to have a couple of teams to call them. There's a citizen or a city employee committee, a couple members of the fire department, a couple members of public works, a couple members of the police department who will be interviewing the candidates, the finalists, and then we'll have a law enforcement group, kind of similar size, 4, 5, 6 people of the local law enforcement community that will obviously be working with the new police chief. And so, although their opinions are, in both cases, interesting and valuable, the search committee is still going to be making the recommendation. And then ultimately, with whatever it'll be, 2, maybe 3 of the finalists, the smallest part that we come up with, maybe we'll use the Egyptians to be determined, but someplace where candidates can literally address the department, or as many members of the department that do it one at a time. They get a chance to see what person might be the leader, and they sure will have thoughts on that as well. And ultimately, the search committee makes recommendations to the council, and the council makes a selection. The city manager typically, by code, has the authority to do all these things, but certainly would not have been in keeping with how far we've come in the way of community participation and the importance of this position for one person to be making a decision like that. And I've been humbled and encouraged by the process so far. But others can speak to it. I don't know what you all think. Do you want to say anything? John?
Or Lisa, anything
It's been looking good.
about the hiring task group that you want to mention, or?
It's been going pretty good. We got some solid candidates.
Since we're right in the middle right now, there's not much they can't say.
Yeah.
Yeah, good, good.
So,
Yeah, I think Bill and John said it's going well.
Good. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. That's, a positive thing, and I think the greater input is just critical for both ourselves as a city, but then also the person that will become the new chief.
so I think we talked about the other members of the committee, so there are 8 altogether, and Monique Bernoulli, who's assistant vice president at the university, equity inclusion, and Glenn Roby, and Don Thomas, retired police chief, and has been helpful in a lot of respects.
And on the overall.
Ernell Brown, my apologies. Ernell is working as really an advocate for persons making reentry into the area after having been incarcerated, and he's got a foundation which is providing some funding support for that, and is very active last summer and fall in the Black Lives Matter leadership of the movement that grew locally here and remains connected in that respect too. So it's been very valuable.
Good.
It's interesting. We have had lots of discussion, but we're finding consensus. I think I wouldn't say easily, but we're finding consensus, and we're moving on after we reach consensus. So we're all committed to that in some fashion. A lot of good discussions. People change their minds or don't change their minds, but we're finding the middle in all this.
Good. Good. I hear that.
That's all I have to say.
And as we had mentioned, I think last time, that House bill that passed,
Yeah.
and then there was I'm going to call it a task group or something, a committee or something, that several issues were delegated to them to consider.
The bill set up the bill charged the governor,
Yeah.
as much as you can charge the governor. I guess it invited the governor to appoint a task force. I don't know if all the members, specific members, but the categories, the different
Representation and what they
yeah,
have to
representations were there.
Yeah.
And that's supposed to make its report by the end of March, so I hope that.
Yeah, because I haven't heard anything or read anything about, they've met and
I don't think they've met as a group yet,
Okay.
but I think maybe the appointments are in process of getting
All right.
posted.
Okay. Any questions for Bill or anything on the police community? All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that update.
Oh, can I introduce Josh? You did after.
Yeah. No,
So
by all means.
just a couple more words if I may, because Josh will be the liaison to the committee from here, commission from here, and Josh is assistant city manager, as he mentioned earlier. He jumped in August, has been very valuable to the work at City Hall, both the routine, his responsibilities include, as with the previous city manager, the finance department and HR. He helped me mightily from about midstream with the fiscal year budget. We go January 1 to December 31st. And he happens to have an acumen for numbers. And he did very well. He just loves, he can jump into a whole multi-layered Excel spreadsheet and where it might take me the whole week, and he knocks it out in an hour. So it did help us keep to a schedule, which is very important. There's so many moving parts there. We get it ultimately obviously to the council for approval, and we're going through hiring in different departments, and with the means that we have, some require the police and fire commission, so there are different layers, and others it's just a matter of getting out with the proper notices, interviews, and we have a couple of people who work in our HR department. He has been helping them with that as well. And then also, he's been working with Scott Zach. I never had to think, because we have a Zach Scott, a Scott Zach, and a Zach Gill working, so there's a lot of Zachs. So anyway, Scott Zach, who some of you knew for many years at WLBK, is the news guy, who's doing some marketing things for us. He does FOIAs as well. It's kind of a potpourri, but he also has kind of a good eye for putting in a pretty succinct fashion whatever that might have grown out of the most recent agenda and so forth. We never really had anybody do that. It's probably a good thing to, rather than just wait for someone to ask him, just put it out there. He's not an embellisher. He just it's the old news guy, so that's fine. That's just what I like to see. So he's doing that. If you ever have any questions about any of those things, you can call me or call Zach. Or Scott. Zach. Sorry.
And in case you need to contact Joshua, he's got his city, website. It's joshua.bolt, BOLDT, at cityofdekalb.com. And
Well, our agenda came from him.
yeah. Is there a city phone number that we should use?
Two phone numbers.
Okay.
Direct to desk is 815-748-2392. Work cell is 815-762-4051.
Okay, thank you.
Can you or Josh just tell something about your background?
Yeah.
My background, I grew up outside of Galena, a town called Stockton, if you're familiar with traveling to and from, or around 20. I came to Northern in 2006. I was a graduate in 2010. Long story short, fell in love with a girl, stayed in the area, still are in the area. She's from Rock Island, and I was hired by our police department, and that's where my career began. And I did 9.5 years with our police department, and trained up to, I think at the end, 14 officers right before Bill brought me on. And Bill and I became acquainted through the police union side of things, where the contract and business negotiation sort of things put Bill and I in time with each other. So, only thing I said to Bill was, give me a fighting chance if I apply, and I was put through the ringer, and here I am now.
Has a master's in public administration.
Yes, thank you.
No small thing.
Okay, great.
And I mean, he's a real good guy, gets back with you, he's easy to talk to, and I think he's right man for the job, so all you got to know that, man, that's what you do.
That's a testimony you can put up.
Get back to me like that, so
Very good.
As long as we're all praising him, he asks great questions and has great comments in executive session as well. So that's been great.
Okay, good. Good, well, obviously, we have to
Yeah.
after the HR.
Yeah.
HRC part of it all.
Thank you.
Okay, If there's nothing else on our police community relations for now, let's move to our main item, which is the landlord tenant review. And the first part of that is sort of a very brief update. As you know, we've been informally working with the DeKalb Tenant Association for a number of months to see what legal services might be available to DeKalb tenants, particularly those that aren't NIU students, because the NIU student has access to the on-campus legal, services. So we worked with the Tenants Association. We've had members here. We've, as you know, I think there was some presentations at city council meetings a while back. And we don't have to go through it all again, but we have heard the gamut, We generally think we've got a majority of good landlords in the area, but we have a couple of non-performing landlords, and it has really brought down the level of tenant satisfaction and risen the concerns quite a bit. We've heard everything from being keys changed on the outer doors of a complex and tenants not receiving new keys, to all the trash out in the parking lot, the whole thing, no security deposits back, never any contacts, no willingness on some landlords to do any kind of walkthrough at the end of the lease so that there can be a mutual review of the status of the apartment. And it just has gone on and on. We've also seen a number of pictures from tenants of their mold, the plumbing that's broken, all the whole gamut. So what the association, the Cal Tenant Association, and our own group, we felt we ought to relook at the Chapter 10 City of DeKalb ordinance on the landlord-tenant ordinance. And we've spent some time looking at it. My first comment would be, I don't know how any person who comes into our town new, let's say they buy an apartment building or a small one, or they're an owner I don't know how one of them could draw their own lease and not omit something that's supposed to be in there. I've spent months with this chapter, and every time I read it, I get a different sense of what it means. So we've worked to try to clarify places, suggest some other kinds of wording, and in some cases, we've been urged to try to build in a little more authority for a tenant in light of what our couple of landlords have been doing for the last number of years. The good landlords don't have to worry about those things because it's never going to come to that point. And we'll get to that in a minute, but just to finish up with the legal services, we're in the process of informally working with the the NIU School of Law, and they have a legal services clinic. And if I understand it correctly, they'll take law students, and as part of an internship, they may have an internship with the legal services clinic. And what we've been trying to discover is particularly, could a DeKalb tenant, who isn't an NIU student, somehow be able to check in there if they've got a legal question related to, the tenancy. So far, it seems to be a favorable reaction. What has stalled it is our first DeKalb Tenant Association organizer, I think, is no longer in the area. And we've had a little bit of trouble trying to get him together with the faculty member at Northern so the two of them can go off and look at all the services needed and see what could be possible. So that sort of hangs there. But we
Do
have...
you know that he's left the area, or just that he's responding to your inquiry?
I'm pretty certain he may have left the area.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see if there's someone else local that's still active with the organization. But that's where that's part of. But as far as the ordinance goes, and let me pass out, this is draft number 3. You pass that down along. This is the latest, and I do want to thank Norton for having taken his Northern's legal eye experience and done some rewording in the more, I think, appropriate legal kind of thing. What I thought I would like to do is just quickly walk you through. You'll see that something in red is our suggestion for additional wording. If you see greening, that's simply a note partially to ourselves, because there may be things that we still think we all need to discuss. And we really need now some input from our local, landlords. The first, I think, more meaningful is if you look at page 3, under the 10.06 code violation disclosure. There's no change that we're suggesting on what's already been written for a number of years, that has to be disclosed to the tenant before there's the execution of the rental agreement. However, there's been several input from the DeKalb Tenant Association that if the tenant signs the rental agreement, but there's code violations that are still out there, and what if it's fairly significant? There's mold in the building, there's whatever that hasn't been addressed, then we're proposing that tenants be able to terminate their lease. But we believe that that would be a real problem for a good landlord where somebody is trying to use that idea. They've got to check in with our code department to confirm that when they signed their lease, that yes, the code violation did exist, and that yes, it still has not been resolved or been addressed. So that's giving the tenant a little more power, but that's the rationale for that. It's for the folks that the city has had a lot of trouble with, and there's been lots of problems in the buildings, to being unsafe conditions, etc. And if I moved into this apartment, signed off on everything, and these code violations were going on and not addressed, and some of them could be significant for a health reason, the tenant ought to be able to get out of the thing. Yeah, Bill?
I don't know if it's okay to just offer a
Sure.
comment. So and this is the first time I've seen this too, so,
Well, this draft,
yeah.
we've given out the other drafts.
Well, I haven't seen any other drafts, other than the existing code. But with the three landlords represented and managers represented here, it occurred to me as I'm reading this, and we've all read through drafts of things, served on committees and so forth. One way to approach it is to get a small group and here's some changes, and then we pretty quickly focus on the wording of the changes. But the big questions aren't really wrestled with until you're almost ready to put it into effect, and then somebody says, oh, well, what about this? And then you kind of have to back into the big questions. And another way, particularly with these folks here tonight, is to maybe identify in a very general way what are the specific things you're looking at. What are the specific things that you've identified as the most egregious problems, or others have come to you? And how are we trying to address them all through this, or is this like one piece of several things, or just as a sort of a roadmap to where we're going? Because if say the commission just makes a recommendation to the council, and then the council asks me and the city attorney for opinions, and then we're going to wrestle over paragraphs and words, and maybe, there's a whole industry out there that they're living on this. So, and many of you, as you say, are very, very constructive, very positive all the time. So, I just thought maybe it'd be good to back up a little bit here, but that's up to the commission, your agenda.
Well, if I could add, I'm glad actually that you said that, because I think, given that we do have guests, and again, I apologize for not being there, I don't know that this approach right now would be the best use of their time. I mean, I think it's great that they see it, and they certainly can add or subtract. But I think we kind of wanted to hear some feedback from them about how they have been successful and how we could use perhaps their knowledge to add to what we're doing as we put information either into this or as we're speaking to people. So I think, no offense, Larry, because I know you put a lot of time in that. I think if we could hear from our guests and maybe get some feedback, you too, Lord, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave you out, Lord. That might help to kind of give us some insight about how they were successful. Because I remember last week, one of the things we discussed was, I'm going to use your first name, Christine, I believe, right? How successful she had been with getting in court. That's one of the reasons why we invited her to come, because we heard really great things. So to not hear that, I think would be, or to wait until you've gone through the whole document, which is not be the use of everybody, the best use of everybody's time. If I can be so forward and suggest that we hear from our guests.
And I want to piggyback on that, Lisa, if I can, just to clarify for our guests, if they weren't aware of it already, that the reason we specifically invited you here this evening is that we think you're doing an exemplary job. We think you're really good at what you do, and we hear about that, as opposed to some other actors in the community. So I don't want you, I hope you don't feel like you're being put on the defensive, like there's a lot of red ink and want to add this, that, and the other. It's, we're very grateful for the work that you do.
And we're not asking you to bash your fellow real.
No.
You're really just trying to get some understanding about how things happen, how you turn things around, how you manage things, because we do get the feedback when it doesn't go well.
I think that's a great idea. That was my intention. I was using that first 10 point, whatever it was, as simply an example And I was not going to go line by line or anything like that, because you have to have a chance to look it over. So I'll dispense with any more things that I think sort of represent the document. You can look it over.
Just as a quick thing on code violations, there's different types of code violations. Some of them are health and safety to the tenant. And then there's a code violation that maybe I didn't paint something and it's a code violation. So here you got just generally any code violation and they can void the lease. Well, maybe it's got to be refined that, you know, that a code violation that's a health and safety issue for the tenant. So you just can't broadly just stroke and, you know, say that. I wouldn't think.
Well, and to put this in context, this document, and it was a little before my time, was originally written between the NIU legal department, is where this came from. The NIU legal department and a group of landlords originally. Now, this document probably needs updated because that was many years ago. There was been minor changes to it as city code has changed, but I don't know if the city can supersede a lease without a court intervening. I think ultimately, thinking out loud, that would end up in the court of law anyway. I don't think the city can make a rule saying that a tenant can terminate a lease without a judge terminating a lease, because ultimately the landlord's going to take the tenant to court and a judge is going to rule. You know, if they back out a lease, the tenant moves out and the judge says, hey, no, that's not true. You owe for 10 more months of rent. Just throwing that out there, that I don't know if you can legislate that or ordinance that from the city. To me, I've always been the person, so, I don't know if Mike served, but I was on the Safe and Quality Housing Task Force many years ago, and I was one of the authors of the crime-free housing ordinance, as well as I pushed for the Police to Community initiative. I think the push needs to be, and I've always said, is to educate the tenants and to make sure they understand what they're getting into. I started many years ago with a one-page lease. One page, basically real simple. But now my lease is 10 pages long. Some landlords' lease is 100 pages long. Why? Because you've always got 90% of our tenants are excellent tenants. 10% of the problems. And it's the 10% of the problems, 10% of your tenants cause 90% of the problems. And probably the same thing in DeKalb. You've got 90% of good landlords and you got 10% of negligible or ones that need help. So you've always got this 90-10 rule. The best thing I think we can always do, and I supported the tenants organization as well, is to educate people so people understand, you know, to inspect a property, to read a lease. And if you don't like signing this lease that's 100 pages long, go somewhere else, find another landlord. You need to, and I've always said, you need, as much as landlords screen tenants, tenants need to screen landlords. And that's the issue, because even in my own world, I want to make sure I have all good tenants, because I have basically 4 simple rules, and the number 1 rule is that you get along with the other tenants. You know, and number 2 is pay your rent on time. Number 3 is I want to see you the day you move in and the day you move out, and then leave the unit as in good a condition as when you got it. 4 simple rules. If I could have a lease with those 4 rules, you know, we'd be all happy. But the reason leases get longer, and I think originally some of this was put into the city ordinances because tenants didn't understand all the little legal things, you know, and options. So I think it's good that we could update this, but I caution that you start writing legislation that's not possible or potentially enforceable. But I would be more than happy to, and Dara, I'm sure, put together a group of people or some ideas of things that could be updated and or changed in here. unfortunately, you know, when we did the crime-free housing ordinance, that really took care of the negligent landlords at the time. But we're dealing now with a new breed of landlords that I would challenge tend to operate above the law. And, you know, we're not sure, even in our own group, we've discussed of how do you try and protect the small landlords and the good landlords, and at the same time, the large landlord, or, you know, the elephant in the room. And to be blunt, I think you have to get, and this goes back before my time, but I know Gideon Court back in the day was a problem. And it was a real challenge for the city. And basically my understanding is the feds came in and threatened with a felony otherwise. And so it has to rise to that level. And you have to get supports from the state's attorney. And our court system is becoming more and more protective of landlords and more protective of tenants' rights. So the courts are protecting, I think, both people's rights, and we seem in gridlock a lot because fines become unpaid. The courts always give extensions to protect property rights. Same way with tenants. Courts always give the tenant extra time before evictions. The courts really hate to rule and be an arbitrator, in my humble opinion. So it's kind of like you're between a rock and a hard spot. And so I've always fallen back on trying to educate the tenants, educate the people. People have power if they're educated and make smart, wise decisions. So, you know, one thing was possibly, and that's where the police, the community initiative is, you know, it was talked about, can you rate landlords, but you don't want to blackball landlords so that people could get more information and how something like that would look like. But in reality, if you go to social network or the media and you start typing in a name of a landlord and you look at the news stories that come up or you look at the Facebook posts, there's a lot of just social media and free information out there. Maybe we need to work on, you know, a section of how tenants would interview and understand the landlord and look at and research a landlord and try and help educate tenants. I mean, that's an area that I think is lacking now. You know, the tenants organization doesn't seem to have that insight or that help or that legal advice, and maybe that's something NIU can help put together too, is how you educate tenants in some kind of pamphlet or booklet and information and how to research the landlord. I've done enough talking.
That's what they had before the tenant landlord handbook, NIU put together for, you know, that they would pass out. The landlord that were like the elephant in the room landlord, if you just go take a look at his properties and things like that, I don't know why you'd rent in the first place. So.
Well, one of the ways that I think, and I appreciate your comments, a couple of concerns that I would have, and well, first of all, I assume that you get together and you have workshops about leases yourselves. I mean, among you know, I mean, I don't know if a common lease is such a good idea or a bad idea, but you know, if there's some comparability. The very first lease that I signed when I came to teach here, you know, like 40 years ago, was about 3 pages. And I remember 2 things about it. It said I couldn't operate a barbershop in the apartment, and ice deliveries had to be made in the back. You know, and this was a lease that
You violated them both.
so this was a lease that somebody, you know, peeled off a pad, you know, from however many years before. I know you update those things. One of the provisions in here has to do with registering rental properties, that in order to rent this unit or that unit, that it be registered with the city. The impetus for that would be, when we're talking about the elephant in the room, that if this person doesn't pay fines, doesn't bring things up to code, rents, these places that are full of mold and so forth and so on, and they don't get fixed, well then, at the end of a certain period, you just can't rent it because you can't register it. You can't register it, and so, and people can't move in there until it's registered, and it can't be registered until it's fixed, period. We also we struggle overall with another thing too, which is, how do you deal with a bad actor that owns 1,000 units, 900 and some units, and so forth and so on, in a community like ours, and not come up with a code that is onerous, for somebody that owns a 2-flat and rents the upstairs or the downstairs and lives in the other part of the house. We don't want to hurt anybody that's in that situation. They're not in the same category, and we don't want to put them in the same.
I think if you're a landlord like that, 2-unit, and you live in it, you can discriminate. You can say, I want.
That's under the Murphy's Law.
Okay.
So you can discriminate.
4 or less, I believe.
Yeah.
So the purposing of registering when we did the crime-free housing and did the registration was to provide the police department, the fire department, and the city of DeKalb with points of contact, emergency phone numbers, and information that was updated on an annual basis so that they had that information. A little bit what you're talking about is more like licensing, where you could revoke a license. The challenge I see with that is, what happens when the landlord, okay, you pull my license, I still rent to the drug dealer, I still rent to these guys for cash. How's the city going to police that? How are they going to enforce it? You fine them, they don't pay fines now. There's no enforcement mechanism if you pull a license or fine, that it's going to compel them to do anything different. I just don't see it happening. You have a negligent landlord that rents to negligent tenants. That's part of the problem, is the negligent tenants. I mean, it says that you have to have a written lease. How many of their leases are written and that are just cash under the table, or as many as you get in this room, and so I don't think licensing will, it's a waste of time.
It just seems like there's nothing possible we can do. You talk about.
Get rid of the landlord.
Yeah, but.
Well, that's what
Hey, but look, Bill said the other time, if anybody's paying attention, what he said was what they do. They go to court, they do all this, they switch attorneys, they go pay a fine or two, then it just repeats itself over and over and over again, to the point where we got to bring gentlemen and, my favorite person over there in, it kind of just puts everybody in a microscope that's good or bad, and it just gets, this situation is getting very frustrating to talk about, because at the end of the day, nothing can happen legally, period. If it can't happen legally, there's nothing we can do, and
unless you can put pressure on the courts and on like the state's attorney, where they can start to enforce state law for criminal housing building management, or find federal laws for housing discrimination, or other federal laws or statutes that you can go after them on. It's beyond a local level at this point until you can get the state or feds, or you make it lucrative enough that they leave. So I hate to say it.
What Will says is true. We have made progress. We've put in as many layers as we can at the local level through council enactments, and we have now something which does not rise to the level of a state statutory violation. So the state's attorney doesn't get involved, unfortunately. But that was that criminal
Building management.
Yeah, building management. But that's just another fine opportunity, and we have to enforce the verdicts. So then we have to go back to state court and get a judgment. ultimately. So there's two steps there. So what John was saying is absolutely true, and that might have taken 6 months to get to the point where the state court will, which is, meets in Sycamore, has an opportunity with the judge to require some status, and then there's, but then, John, as John said, there's oftentimes lots of, or you were saying, Will, lots of latitude, many extensions, many reappearances and so forth, and then now you've got another 6 months. And then the judge is looking for some kind of a settlement, which doesn't really settle anything. You have to pay a little, but the violations never really got addressed, and then there's, by that point, another $400,000. And this is all true. This isn't just made up. These are real numbers and so forth. What happened, happily, with not getting court before was really pretty tough living, and a new company came in, new ownership and management, and they were truly interested in the welfare of the tenant. Tough
Yeah.
rules.
What
tough
happened,
rules.
they got a resident council, they got a council
That's right.
together, a council of people, and they had the right to purchase the property first, under the old LIPRA, low-income energy or preservation. And so the council purchased the property. And that was great, and they got a lot of loans and money and put a lot of money into it and stuff. But, I tell people, you can put lipstick on a pig and you're still gonna have a pig. And we still had a pig over there. And when I got there, it was really a matter of changing attitude, because people were still feeling like they were being looked at, and the cameras are in hidden places, and it was management against the residents, and it wasn't any of this. And we just had to go out there and say, listen, no, we're committed to this place, and we're gonna do what it needs to do to, you own this. Now, the residents own it. It's not like it's the condominium, they can't sell it, but they have a voice. And their voice is a part of, like, when we upgrade the apartments, they get a committee together, and they choose what they want to upgrade in their apartments and stuff. So they have a voice, which is extremely powerful. I work for the residents. However, if they do something wrong, I have to hand down the violation as well. So it really became this relationship where we respected each other. I'm going to give you a great place to live. I will back you up. I'll give you security and safety and cleanliness, but you got to be a good tenant. And they love living there. People love living there because it is safe and clean and all the things that we have going on, but you have to get rid of the old stinking thinking. It's not going to change. If you keep that management company, they don't respect the people that live there. I don't care how, and yes, education of the residents is so important. And some of them may walk if you educate them and they know what to do, but most of them are going to be scared. Because I kind of hear what's going on in some of these properties, and there's some extortion in a sense, I believe. Same thing that happened there. People would come in after you go shopping, when they see you leave, maintenance was breaking into your apartment. Residents were leaving baby powder on the floor to see if somebody came in while they were gone. Nobody trusted anybody over there. And it's just not going to happen.
And the sad part, and I don't want to turn this, meeting into that, property company, but, the sad part is some of these people have no other alternatives, whether they're good or they're bad. So, it's a sad situation.
Yeah. And that's the sad part.
But the even sadder part of the whole thing is there's nothing that can honestly be done legally unless you go Springfield somewhere. That's just the just of it. And that's just where you feel defeated sometimes.
Yeah.
Captain, what you asked us out, what do you?
Here's the upside to those pictures.
I was hoping there was an A and a
There's
B,
a couple
right?
of- couple of things of how it looks
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
I mean, I didn't run around and do a lot of pictures, but the last few are just showing, we have a lot of activities. I mean, I could print stuff out all day, but it's well lit now, it's clean. We have regular, pest control that comes through, most landlords do. But it was really respecting the people. You have to show them respect and they'll respect back. And you know what, if you don't, on out the door and take the next one in. Your choice.
So this is your place
Before and after.
before?
Correct.
And how long ago was?
Those pictures, it turned hands in 1997. So those were in 97, yeah.
We don't have police calls.
No, I've heard that from,
No, and you.
I've heard that
you
from
had-
police officers for years, what a difference you've made.
Yeah, I mean, you know what, people deserve good housing, and I am the biggest tenant advocate, I really am, so. They deserve good housing, a lot of people don't have the knowledge of what they need or their rights. I tell them no, these are your rights here, you know. But truly, it's the landlords that care, and that's what's gonna show. I don't see how you're gonna, I really don't. You can educate the people, but they're gonna be scared. Who's gonna talk up, especially if there's extortion and stuff going on over there, you know? Now, I'd be afraid to death to say anything if I lived in that area, and
So Christine, sorry if I'm interrupting you. So I'm hearing that there may be more of an impact if all of us were to work together to create a on-site manager's training on building tenant relationships.
you could.
I mean, I just, hearing you talk, I can tell that you're relatable. If I was a tenant and, I walked down the hall and I saw you, I could yell out, hey, you got a minute, or whatever, and you would attend to the thing, et cetera. But apparently we've got some on-site, particularly landlords or managers or whatever, that are hard to get a hold of,
Mm-hmm,
as hard to talk to.
mm-hmm.
Well, they live in Winnetka.
Well, some of them do, yes. Yeah. So that was just something off the top of my head that I thought I was hearing that is there? I mean, I'm sure we can find somebody that does that type of training.
I don't think it's training, Larry, because the people that need to be trained, particularly at the Hunter properties, I can say it.
Sure.
It's true. Aren't interested.
Yeah.
in being trained.
No.
They're doing what they're expected to do, and they're getting rewarded for it. But eventually, those things, they really do get worse. And then they hit a point where it's possible to charge the management with higher felonious violations that can just shoo them to some other place in other words, to leave here because it's just a little too hot.
Well,
That's
the
happened.
squeaky wheel gets the oil.
That's
Remember
happened,
that.
and I can't say where we are, but we're making progress on that line. That's all I can say.
And you're right, at the federal level. That's exactly what needs to
So,
happen here.
in the meantime, though, what I hear is you've got three really apostles of what good management is about, and I think they're interested. They're all because they're so good at this. They're all involved. We're always trying to pull them in. They took, how do we do this? How do we do that? But I think, can't speak for you, speak for yourselves, but we have the core of a working group if we wanted to go forward toward something, any changes, that's what you were offering, Will.
Yeah, no,
And-
it wouldn't
And
hurt
then
to
we
look
come
up
out of
there.
this, we're sort of arm in arm. I mean, collaboration is really the word of the day. I think we can't do
There
it.
was some discussion at some point that you had brought up the idea. If the problem with code enforcement, for one thing, is you haven't got the staff, of creating a TIF district surrounding some of these properties that essentially would set aside money to pay for code enforcement. I don't know if that's, I'm being naive about this, but, my instinct is to say, well, what we need, you can't rent this building if it's in this shape. Nobody can live here until this is fixed, period. And And sure, I mean, things can happen under the table and so forth and so on. But it seems to me that one could, without hassling people, it should be easy to tell if somebody's living here or somebody's not living here.
Just an interesting suggestion. If there are no antecedent events and bad history and so forth, unfortunately, which we're still bearing the brunt of, you could probably qualify at least as a conservation area, which is like middle of the ground tip, not a blighted area necessarily. A lot of the AGN neighborhood, from underground utilities to the condition of, look at the, even Greek Road, and in some of these larger apartment complexes. And you could roll that together, and the state would put their hand over and say, yes, this is it, and all the local taxing bodies would be willing to do that, but that's not where we are right now. We have a TIF 3, which is this little skinny downtown TIF. One last year, the grand eminence of the TIF 1, which is thankfully going away. But such still angst about tax increment financing in our community here, which is very sad, because it never lived up to the promise of what it could have been.
Right.
And tens of millions of dollars just went other places than in what was identified as the original TIF. So it'll take some years to.
Well, you and I
we
go
were.
back when I was on school board.
I mean, Calhoun Fisk was the classic TIF. People applied.
Yes.
It took a long time to work out, but it ultimately, in 20 years, paid for itself, and it benefited so many people. And this is a housing area that's much run down and so forth, right? So, and there are many more, and partly on the northwest side, partly in other parts of town, but we're not going to get there. I know I can go before the school board now and say, hey, let's get a new TIF. I'd be upside down and sideways out the door. So, I think, though, we have to be creative. I'm not saying that almost never can you say never, but it would be tough, very tough. It would consume all of our energy and a lot of other people's energy, and have to build a coalition around it. It would take some years, I think, probably to get to that decision point. But I'm open to it. I don't know if I'll still be alive when it's ready. But in the meantime, I think we have to work together and collaborate. Let's do what we can to do the best with what the fabric of the local ordinances are. And there's still going to be 100 properties out there defying and flaunting it. And we're just going to have to eventually bring that group to ground. And it's going to be a long legal process. That's what we're working on. It's costing a lot of money. There's no amount of code enforcement that will make any difference there. We're just basically ignoring all of it. And, just today we had a meeting. Anyway, I don't want to go into detail. It's just, and we're in court right now looking for a settlement. The highest the judge wants to go is $150,000 out of over $400,000 in fines. And the fines don't speak to the problems behind the fines, right? I mean, these are not, a little bit of paint and so forth. These are really egregious things that cause people to have to leave their apartments for a while and then eventually come back. There are life safety things, just health related. And so it goes. There's always that mountain of owed and unresolved fines, violations. Violations is really what the tenant is most concerned about. That's what they have to live with.
Well, I think if there's going to be a coalition of some sort formed, that one of the cases that has to be made, and I don't know if this is maybe for a judge or this is, but one of the things the community has to be made aware of is what the cost is to the community. Not just in terms of here are these unpaid violations, but this is how many police calls, this is the number of clients that are sent to Youth Services Bureau. These are the number of kids that are at risk. These are the this is you know, this is how social services in our area is affected because of the living conditions that people are forced to put up with.
Yeah, but most don't care about that, is what.
Oh,
Most of the people that don't listen, I'm trying to tell you, I see it. Most of them, that they get in there are people who just don't want to be on paper, don't want to know where they're at. It's
Talking about 808 Ridge in particular.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, it's the worst. It's almost like living like downtown, like on the west side of Chicago, like, it's like a war zone. And the funny part about it is this, somehow, some way, our police get blamed for going in there and doing what needs to be done. So it's a circle that people keep blaming people, and like Bill just said, you know, judges don't want to do this or they don't want to do that. Then it's just a circle that we just keep doing. We just keep wasting.
I've actually spent a lot of time there, not lately, but, and I'm retired now as a pastor, but, you know, I see, part of what I did, all for years, was have people come in at the beginning of the month, they couldn't pay their rent. And, you know, the 100 properties, you know, so forth and so on. And part of what I did was to try to help get people beds, get people dressers, get people furniture. So I've been in those buildings a lot, actually. But, and I feel for the people that live there, because some of them are absolutely wonderful people.
Well, there's some
Find
are,
themselves in a
hey,
bad situation.
there's good and bad people everywhere, however.
Still that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's good and bad people, you know, but however, you know, some of the most egregious crimes we hear in our area come from that building. So it just gets to a point where, you know, it just gets frustrating. And, you know, it's like people like us, you know, we're on the HRC, we're trying to do the best we can. But at the end of the day, we just can't do much because there's always some, you know, legal implications that we can never cut through, period. And then we get people like this, you know, who are doing what they're supposed to do and who honestly are the reason why, you know, the cow is holding on. But then you get a certain property management that just tears it all up and it makes the whole town go to hell. And it just gets to the point where it just gets frustrating because at the end of the day, there's always a legal matter that a group of people like us can't do anything about.
I just don't want to get there and say there's nothing we can do about it.
Well, what can we do?
Because
Besides
I've got the 4-year-old and the 7-year-old running around my office while I'm talking to mom, or while I'm talking to dad, or while I'm talking to mom and dad.
Okay, well, maybe then we should go back then to, you know, Pitsley or Cruz.
So there's a lot of
You know,
pieces.
direct them that way.
Yes.
Tenant education, I think we should identify what we need to work on, that we can find some strong common ground. Tenant education is one, is general. But to give you an example, so a lot of the tenants of the 100 properties didn't know this, but right now there's still a freeze on evictions, right? But if you're behind in your rent, what they do is they tow your car.
Yes.
Now, I thought, you can't do that, but you know what? They signed a lease saying, I understand, you know, and it comes after that, I understand and everything like that, and then, and by the way, we'll tow your car. And you sign it on the bottom line as a contract. So their car is towed. All we can do is enforce that they don't charge more than what the code says they can charge for storage for a day or 2 or 3, but that doesn't do much for them. And then there's that other issue about how do they pay to get their car back, which they need to get to the job, which is barely giving them enough to keep them in the apartment as it is. And that is what taxes our social network. Over the weekend, and it was a cold holiday weekend, wasn't for many people, but it was for public and not-for-profits, a lot of not-for-profits who have emergency assistance money. I ended up spending all day yesterday with a couple of people, and Ernell was involved in trying to advocate for some people from 808 Ridge. Their car had been towed. They couldn't, anyway, the point is that there isn't enough general assistance funds in this town right now a lot of these things. So, but right now we're talking about housing. We can't solve all the things, but if we really want to focus on housing, I think we could, in pretty short order, identify the issues we want to work on. Tenant education is very important. We can do that pretty quickly. You know, identify the things that we want people to know about, and then we talk to whatever groups are out there. There aren't many. There aren't many, because it's hard to keep a tenant association together here, I mean, because there's so much turnover. College town, that's the way it is. People don't stay in their apartments for 20 years, or 10 years.
No, they're terrible.
No, and especially not if they're terrible.
Yeah.
We should say, go to Pitchley's, go to Christine's.
I was gonna say, I can't get rid of them. My oldest, I've got one that's been there 38 years.
So I guess the question is, what do you want to do? And
I got a question.
Yes, Lisa?
Is it possible for us to provide some material for tenants in every building from the city that lets tenants know that they have some rights and that there's things that we should expect and not expect from a potential landlord or realtor, and maybe this occurs before they sign? I don't know if you can have housing fairs where you explain information or prior to people going, particularly people who have limited resources. I mean, I would think that as an HRC, there's something we could do to assist tenants, either those who are living there who may or may not renew their lease, and maybe running intercession prior to before the sign of the lease.
Yeah. So, Lisa, the NIU student legal thing, I came across something of a tenant education kind of pamphlet that covers a lot of things that if we do any further education, you know, it's a basis document that seems to cover a lot of territory.
Isn't there a tenant's handbook?
Yes,
Is that what we're talking
the
about?
city
there is.
also has, as we talked about earlier, depending on which version, it's either the tenant's handbook or the landlord tenant's handbook. And we were thinking, we've had some discussions here, that it's quite a busy document and a little hard to wade through. And the Tenants Association folks, and we've had some discussions, why don't we separate those into two separate ones? You know?
That was about a 4-year conversation, if I recall. And I was working at Northern at the time, and I was a Northern rep to those conversations. It was about 12, 13, 14 that it was coming to a head. Is that timing about right, the landlord-tenant and the crime-free lease and so forth,
Yeah.
or maybe the second iteration. And so the idea was to emphasize the reciprocal responsibilities and duties. So put it all together, and maybe it's denser that way and so forth. I think we could look at that. Our failing, and Lisa's right, it was designed that every landlord would register, and then they would hand out these at the time of the signing of the lease and so forth, and here are your duties, here are our responsibilities, and it was a nice conversation. That doesn't happen now, especially when this one company owns 1,000 units.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 1 out of every 6 units in town, or 5, whatever the number is now. And so you're effective where you were already effective to begin with. You know, the people like these 3 back here who make it clear what the landlord tenant responsibilities are.
Well,
And then the problem is you come up with this beautiful handbook
Yes.
that people don't read because first of all, it's too long.
Yes.
And it really needs to be focused
Legally.
on.
well, I wonder, I mean, my gut feeling is I think we ought to be embarrassing people. I think we have to identify who actually owns 100 properties. And then I think we have to stand outside their houses in Evanston or in Casset and say, you know how this guy makes money? You know how your neighbor makes money? And I think...
They're probably making money the same way next door.
No, well, maybe they are,
Yeah.
but I think you have to make people uncomfortable at the country club.
So I
mean, that's one thing. And the second thing I think you need to do is I think we need to, if it's the court system, And I don't know who we make the case to, but we have to make the case that this is systemic, that this isn't just the kennel, because Hunter Properties doesn't just operate in the kennel. They own places in West Lafayette, and they own places in Bloomington, and they do the same damn thing in all these other localities. And this is their business model, and it's not just our town.
So one of our court things is to require a judge, or to get a judge to require Hunter Properties to reveal all their assets. What is that called?
Discovery.
Yeah, so we are prevailing in that.
Okay.
That will help. So we have about 4 or 5 of these things going. Part of it is just to get some money for the fines. And part of it is to engage a higher level of law enforcement, federal or state. And then we're doing these other things. And the judge has ruled, but that's the, you can describe it better than I. Judge can rule and write an order and say this shall happen. And then who enforces that? Somebody, you have to take it back to the judge to enforce their order, or some other judge, because we can't enforce that. We the city have no authority to enforce that. So that's what we're doing now. But we had a judgment, and we're looking to get that enforced. Now that will be available. That'll be public information, and we could we could broadcast that. Will it make a difference? I don't know, but it certainly would show the tentacles of that company in Northwest Indiana and Bloomington and other places. Eventually, are they going to get tired of it? I don't know. So far they're not getting hurt very much.
Yeah.
They only got hurt when they had the fire, and that really cut into the lease revenue. But now, those are all occupied units.
I have 2 points if I could make.
Yeah.
One is, I know that, yes, I heard you mention about a working group. So I'm wondering if it's possible if our guests could maybe bond with us, collaborate, and we have a working group. And I know Lord and Larry have already processed. The other piece of that is whether or not there's something that we could create, a document that is brief, that really highlights or outlines the factors or the aspects that people, potential tenants should look at. And ironically, I think local people and students will benefit from that kind of a document because of the ways in which they receive information. I don't know if people moving to the town, how they would get it. But we can maybe put it at social service agencies, we could put it at DCFS, we could put it at the township. I mean, I think that we can come up with something. And, today we can name a particular landlord or renter, but tomorrow it may be another person, it may be another name, it may be another entity. And so I think the goal is just really what is it that's our goal, right? We want to inform people, we want to make sure that they're clear about what their rights and responsibilities are. And so if we can get that kind of information to them, even if it's ran an article, well, I guess a newspaper is not as popular as it used to be, but something that's in a publication where people have access, open access to it.
We talked about giving tenants agency to be able to deal with the problem since the city really can't enforce things. But the problem is, you mentioned the parking. Larry and I put into this proposed change to the ordinance that's prohibited. If you can't tow a car to collect rent. But then the question becomes, if they do tow a car, you still have to somehow enforce that. And
That's right.
and the individual tenant doesn't have the wherewithal to do that.
Yeah.
That's the tough.
Well, you also have the issue that if you're in Section 8 housing, you can't withhold rent.
Oh.
Because the easiest thing in the world to do in property like we're talking about is a rent strike. But you can't do that if you're in Section 8 housing.
Hey, so is Hunter and Hunter Star 2 separate companies? Or you like
Oh, they're diversified, they have legal LLCs, standing and so forth, but it's sort of related.
Yeah.
What I think is really nice is that you guys want to help basically the Annie-Glidden North area. Will and I are on the Annie-Glidden North Action Committee, and there's some other opportunity at DeKalb, which is up in that area too. So we would love to collaborate with you to help
Good.
with this as far as education of tenants, providing things like that. I'm sure we could, have a couple of our guys meet with you guys. And it's all for the best of that neighborhood. That's how we're thinking. We're not thinking it's the landlords are gonna benefit, the tenants are gonna, no, the whole town's gonna benefit.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
we'd love your help.
I think there's positive stuff going on in that neighborhood, and with Facebook and Fiera and the growth that DeKalb is doing, and with this AGN and providing busing to get residents to jobs and back and forth, that I've always said to try and help that neighborhood, help the residents, and raise all ships. And I think that's part of it, is if you can raise and help the residents and the community to where you've got, people wanting to improve themselves, improve the building, and it's going to have an upward effect, which we haven't had, recently. And I would look at 4 years ago, if you went to Zillow, Facebook Marketplace, DeKalbrents.com, go to your rental places, you would see 200, 300 units available, and now it's less than 100. I mean, the market is getting tighter, which tells me